Thank you. I'm glad that you guys are here. Tonight is soil, talking about all the things that are in the soil that are going on in your soil. And I usually think soil seems pretty inert, but there is a lot going on in there. So tonight we're going to talk what's the difference, real difference between organic and synthetic growing in soil systems. Is it inert? No. And it's full of this ecosystem that we're going to learn about, and then talk soil tests and how to get scary soil tests, help interpreting your scary soil tests, how to grow soil amendment while suppressing weeds. And we're going to see John McInnes and I think Judy Hart's favorite tomatoes too. Last time John was talking about tomatoes that ripen early, and he volunteered to send his list. And then Judy Hart texted in that she was interested in doing so also. So that'll be nice. So my presentation is usually an hour. It's going to be a little shorter, so then we'll have a few minutes at the end for questions about those tomatoes. So, first off, I would like to talk about this statement that we all learned in middle school or elementary school. Plants make their own food, so they don't need anything, right? Because plants make their own food. Well, here's what plants do. Plants take carbon and oxygen from carbon dioxide and hydrogen and oxygen from water, and they exhale some of the oxygen, and they rip the rest of it apart and rearrange it, and they make this. This is what photosynthesis makes. It's sugar, and it doesn't really leave the plant, it stays in. It's sugar, it's glucose. That's what plants make. So there are three things they can do with that glucose. They can stack a bunch of them together, and that makes starch, like a potato. They can rearrange them, and they can make some vitamins, and they can even make some fats and things like that. Or they can use other elements, magnesium, sulfur, phosphorus, calcium, all those things that sound like things that we need in our diet as well. And they can rip these apart and rearrange with those elements, including those elements, to make all the other things that we need nutritionally and that the plant needs. And in fact, this whole mechanism right here cannot function if all it has is glucose. There are molecules and little machines in this plant doing 1,000 things, and they need the same kind of other nutrients that we need. For example, this is not going too far into chemistry, but this is a chunk of chlorophyll. It's part of the chlorophyll molecule. Look, it's got magnesium and nitrogen. Your plant doesn't have enough magnesium and nitrogen. It's not going to be able to collect sunlight with chlorophyll and make that sugar. Here's a chunk of protein. Proteins are a lot bigger than this, but this is the basic. See that nitrogen? That nitrogen is in all the protein that's in your body. Your bones are like more than half protein. They'd be like chalk if you didn't have that. So we always think, oh, it's just in my muscles, but it's in your whole body, and it's in all many of the chemicals that run your body, and many of the hormones like insulin need protein. And if you don't have nitrogen, you don't have protein. And the nitrogen that you have, all the atoms came from a plant, and that plant did not make it. It got it out of the soil, and ultimately it got it from bacteria, but we'll talk about that later. Here are vitamins. You can see that vitamins have other elements in them. And then there are all these minerals that we require. The plant requires them too to be healthy. So the healthier we make our plants, the healthier we make ourselves. For example, here's just one example. Calcium allows the plant to use nitrogen. It makes the cell walls strong, so crispy cucumbers and tomatoes without that black patch on the bottom, if you've ever had that, that's because it's not using calcium correctly. And being tougher, having crispy cell walls, means that the plant is resistant to diseases. And calcium itself promotes cell division. It's part of that mechanism. And cell division is what makes the plants grow. So it regulates the growth. So that's just one of the elements. And this is how we got all of these elements for the history of the world. The history of animals being on the world is animals died or produced manure, and it just went round in a circle. That went into the plants, and then that went into the animals. Wasn't always domestic animals, of course, but this was not known, this is now known as the synthetic model, the synthetic agriculture model, not synthetic, I'm sorry, the organic agriculture model. But it wasn't forever known as the organic model because there was no synthetic model. There was no synthetic fertilizer for a long, long time. So this was just known as the way things work until we had this happen. That. Now, this guy's not in the 1880s, but in the 1800s, we learned to isolate nitrogen. We didn't have to get it from manure anymore. And we were getting better and better at isolating things like phosphorus. So we didn't have to get that from manures either. So we began to be able to do synthetic fertilizing. And in the 1880s, it was really expensive. You had to build a factory. So hardly anybody used it. But then I have a trivia question for you. What is this guy doing? I'll tell you, he's isolating nitrogen, but why is he doing it? Because we didn't do it, even though we could, we didn't do it at very big scale for a long time. But I'll give you clues and progressively clearer clues. He's in just before the middle of the 20th century. He's in a factory that was funded by the federal government in the middle of the country, nowhere near the coasts. He's isolating nitrogen. If I tell you it's 1940, does that help? Or what if I tell you that the N in TNT stands for nitrogen? He's making bombs. So he's not literally making them, but he's isolating the nitrogen. And the reason that the federal government invested in 5 big nitrogen isolating factories was, well, because we were fighting. And then the war ended and we had this synthetically isolated chemicals. And American farmers could do well by doing good. We fed the world. We started agricultural extension office training. That wasn't the first agricultural extension office, but we did a big push in that training to teach farmers to use synthetics because they're very different. And after we started doing that, here's what happened to the nutrient content of crops. So you might think that this is just one study that shows that the nutrients in crops dropped significantly. But there are multiple studies. And I don't mean for you to read all of this text. What I mean is to show you that there are multiple studies and also to tell you that there is a link on the resource page, which the link for the resource page is in the chat. And there's a link in that resource page to the Scientific American article that talks about this. My favorite part is the one at the bottom, though. To get as much vitamin A as our grandparents would have gotten from 1 orange, we have to eat 8. Even if it were, 2 oranges, I'd rather eat the more nutritious one. So what's the difference between synthetics and organics? In this graphic, I wish this said organic fertilizers and amendments, because fertilizer and amendments are part of the organic system. And quite often synthetic systems don't use amendments. So let me just show you for a sec, what is the difference? A fertilizer is concentrated and we know exactly how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are in it. So that's like the bag that says 693 on it. That's concentrated fertilizer, and they're telling you how much is in there. Fish emulsion, blood meal, cottonseed meal, or the bag with the numbers on it. If it's an organic one, that is an organic fertilizer. And amendments are less concentrated. So that's compost, rotted manure, rotten leaves, that kind of thing. It improves the soil texture and it improves the water holding and nutrient holding, and it feeds the soil organisms. But we don't usually, it's less concentrated and we don't usually know how much nutrient is in it. So what happens when we give fertilizers and amendments, organic ones, that are made out of basically food that we think is not digestible? You know, we eat the cantaloupe because we can digest it, but we give the rind to the compost pile. It's still got carbs in it. So we say carbon, but it's got carbohydrates, and they're eating it and it's running their tiny bodies. So these are like bacteria and fungi and things like that in the soil. So we feed that to the soil, they break it down. It has to go through microorganisms. Organic fertilizers generally have to go through our organisms to get turned into another form. So they either excrete it or they die, and then the plant can take it up. So it's this ecosystem that's cycling nutrients in there. Synthetic fertilizers are pure forms. They're one chemical, usually each. You can mix them to make a 369 fertilizer, something like that. But they aren't attached to big molecules. There's not carbon food in there. And they're dissolved in water. So they don't go in and feed the organisms in the soil. They just dissolve in the water and the plant just sucks it right up. That's why you're supposed to water before and after you put on synthetic fertilizers. So this is super analogous to our gut bacteria. We're realizing, I know my 4th grade textbook told me one day I'd just be able to take a pill for all my daily nutrients, but we're finding out that it's probably a good idea to feed those gut bacteria because they're making things that we don't even realize. We don't even know what they're doing, but it turns out we're discovering every day that they're good for us. So this is very like our gut bacteria over here. This is sort of equivalent to saying, I need vitamin C, so I'm gonna eat an orange. That's the organic system. The synthetic system is, I need vitamin C, so I'm gonna put vitamin C powder in a glass of water and drink it. You get the nutrients, it just doesn't have the same microbiome, you might call it. So even the EPA now says that the soil is a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants and animals and humans. And of course, the EPA said it, the USDA, sorry, says that. And they're not foot dragging, but they like to know, they like to understand and make sure there's a lot of science behind something before they say it. So how can you have healthy soil? Here's how. You can know what parts of the inorganic parts of your soil do. I'm a little tired, so I'm stammering. So we talk about sand and silt and clay. So clay and sand and silt are not from living organisms, so we call that inorganic. So sand is really gritty and big particles, and clay is teeny tiny particles, and silt is in between. Clay we love because it holds moisture. We hate it because it holds moisture. If we have just straight clay, we're mad at it because it's too sticky, but it's really great at holding moisture and nutrients. And sand, we hate it if it drains too much and we have too much sand, but we love it because it helps our soil drain. So what we like is a mix. We love a mix of sand and clay, and silt is probably going to be in there as well. That's good. And a certain percentage of organic matter, like 5 to 10% organic matter. And we call that loam. So that is good looking soil. Do you see the holes in that? Do you see that it's a chunk and he hasn't broken it up into a powder? That's also really important. Loam has, once it has an ecosystem in it, has some interesting qualities. And they partly come from this mix of sand and clay. It's invisible at this scale, but nutrients can only stick to the outside of the particle because this piece of sand is a rock and nutrients can't soak into it. So sand only can hold nutrients on the surface, like right here. Clay is so tiny that if you had a ball of clay that was this big, you'd really have like 1 million particles, and each particle would be able to hold nutrients on its surface. So those nutrients would be all through there. That's why clay can hold nutrients better and hold water better. In fact, these are all clay. And so each little Pringle in a stack has a surface on which the particles can stick. So particles of molecules of nutrients can stick. Oh, but I do have one caveat. The surface of all the particles, whether it's sand or clay or silt, they're negatively charged, so positive stuff will stick to them. If you have a negative molecule, it won't stay there. It won't stay in the soil. If it's a positive molecule, it'll stay just long enough for the plants to take it up. So whether something's negative or positive can make a difference. And I'll tell you why that's relevant in a couple minutes. If you want to know about what you've got in your yard, you do not have to do a soil texture test. You can just put compost in and fertilizer and start growing. But if you'd like to know, you have 63% sand, you have quite sandy soil or a lot of clay or something, you can do this texture test with a jar and either dish detergent or water softener and some dirt. And I have links for how to do it, so I'm not going to go into details here. But on the page, there's a print version and there's also a video version. And sometimes it's surprising. You think, oh, I must have clay, but you really just have compacted silt or something like that. Oh, there's this word tilth, and I just thought we should address it. It means good soil. It means easy to dig into, not like potting soil easy, but it doesn't break your fork. And it smells good, and it's that dark color, and it's got air pockets in it, and it has aggregates. So aggregates are chunks. And I think a lot of people, their dad or their grandfather would bring out the rototiller and put the garden in all in one day and just pulverize the soil to powder. But we're finding out, as farmers knew before, that that is not such a good thing to do because we want aggregates. So here is a close-up on aggregates in the soil. They're chunks. They let water through because they have spaces between them, so your soil can drain. But the little pockets hold moisture. So all these tiny holes hold the moisture. So it keeps your soil, that thing that you sometimes see on a plant label. It'll say this plant prefers well-drained but moisture retentive soil. So that's how you get it. The little orange dots are bacteria. They are breaking down and sharing nutrients with plants, and they're also making biogums that retain moisture and hold the soil together. So they actually build these houses for themselves or contribute to it. These are not roots, these stringy things. These are fungal hyphae. Sometimes they're called mycelia if you have a lot of them, or hyphae. They are actually the body of the fungus. This is the main body of the fungus. It's also the absorbing, so it's like the roots, it's the absorbing part. The mushroom that you see above ground is just the fruit. It's like the peach of the peach tree. So these fungi hold these together. They absorb nutrients. They transport them through the soil, and they can share them with plants in very symbiotic, interesting relationships. The next thing that you can do is learn about the organisms in your soil ecosystem. I'm not going to describe every one of these, but they are all really important. Even when we see fly larvae and we think that can't be good, they have a job. These little micro arthropods shred. They're the first shredders of some of that organic material. They eat fungi, so we need those fungi. And you know that great smell of soil, that wonderful garden soil smell? It is largely the exhalation of Actinomycetes fungus. So what else? How many are in there? So let's think about just bacteria. On the left is some probiotic yogurt, and they work super hard under perfect conditions and give it just what it needs, and they get 500 million bacteria in that yogurt. In a teaspoon of soil, there's a lot of stuff that isn't bacteria. There's sand and silt and clay and chunks of inedible whatever. How many bacteria in a teaspoon of soil? Says the USDA and many other researchers. Up to 1 billion. So it's a lot. It's 200 million to 1 billion typically. And there are yards of fungi very, very thin, and tens of thousands of other organisms. There are bacteria, fungi, protists, they're one-celled things like amoebas, teeny tiny worm-like things. And these are microarthropods. They look like insects and they're relatives of insects, but they are not insects and they're very, very small. This one at its most mature form might be a quarter of an inch long, but a lot of them are like as long as an M dash on a piece of paper. So they're really tiny. So these are all in your soil when you're looking at it. We just can't see them necessarily. So a teaspoon of soil can have more organisms in it than there are people on the earth. And you can have 10 to 50,000 different species in a teaspoon. Kind of amazing, I think. So let's look at two. One is mycorrhizal fungi. Look at this fantastic root system on this plant. Isn't it gorgeous? It's not roots, it's fungus, because this plant was growing and it took some of the sugar it made and it exuded it through its roots, which are about here, and there's one there. It put the sugars out through its roots. It shared a little bit, and there were fungal spores, and they got to use those sugars to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. So the fungus spread through the soil. And it is now sharing, it's now sharing with the plant. So the plant has sort of an extended root system. Bacteria help plants absorb nutrients. This plant in particular has made little hotels for the bacteria. These bacteria pull nitrogen literally out of thin air and give it to the plant. And the plant in exchange gives a little hotel room for them. Plants that do that, not all plants do it. These plants are called legumes, and they are vetch, clover, peas, beans, and I can't think of the other one, alfalfa maybe. They also, other bacteria don't have these little hotel room relationships. These are called root nodules of rhizobial bacteria, but some of them just coat the roots and they make that biogum that is humectant. It attracts water. So plants that have those are drought resistant. So in this process, there are cycles happening. So it goes into the soil and then it grows a plant and then we eat the plant and then we exhale the CO2 and the plant takes it back in. So you've seen these cycles before, but look at this. Do not memorize this, but note that almost everything has a cycle. I could have put 90 cycles on here. So my point is that if like in an ecosystem, if the food cycling stops, life stops. This is part of that. These are the nutrient cycles, and look at how much of each one is underground. So those underground cycles don't happen without those organisms. So now we have a little better understanding of the importance of the organisms underneath the soil. So how do we support them? First, do no harm. I bet you could have written this if you just had to brainstorm. What would you avoid? It's herbicides and pesticides, and don't pulverize the soil when you're tilling it. And salty manure is probably not a problem here, but some people get straight steer manure off a feedlot, and that has a lot of salt in it. And synthetic fertilizers and neglecting organic matter are things that we would want to avoid. So we can do all of those things and prevent soil compaction. So this is why our beds are only 3 to 4 feet wide, because we don't want to walk in those beds. So we have pathways between them, and we don't dig in sopping wet soil and not bone dry soil. We want to dig in moist soil. So a lot of soil out there right now is super wet. And by the way, I think I saw it's going to be nearly an inch of rain on Thursday. So if you want your soil to dry out so that you can dig it without making bricks out of it, which is what happens if you turn soil when it's wet, you can put, I'm sorry to say, maybe some salvaged plastic over the top, but plastic will help keep it drier. If you're wondering, is it dry enough to dig, you grab a handful of it and you squeeze it, and then you give it a poke, and it should break into a couple of pieces, not powder, and it shouldn't squish like modeling clay. It should be dry enough to sort of break a little bit. And of course, we can add compost. You're going to see me say add compost like 27 times tonight, but it doesn't mean add 27% compost. Like 5% is fine. So just add an appropriate amount of compost, which for a brand new garden in soil in the ground is between 2 and 4 inches. That's really ample. That's a lot of compost. But then in future years, you can do an inch of compost every year and turn that in, because we have to keep feeding that soil. You can feed the ecosystem organic matter that way. So weirdly, compost solves the drains too well problem of sand, and it also solves the doesn't drain enough problem that clay has. So compost can really help you. It stores nutrients and gives them back slowly to plants. Whereas synthetics can get into the soil water, and then as you water, they can rinse out. And it supports microbes that are going to make your garden resilient to all kinds of things. So if you look at your new garden and it hasn't quite developed an ecosystem yet, it's going to get better as you add more compost and year by year let that ecosystem develop in your garden. So basics about fertilizers. So this is N, P, and K on the front. K stands for potassium because that makes sense. So these are called the macronutrients. And then there are secondary nutrients that are calcium and magnesium and things that we think of as minerals that our bodies need. And then there are these micronutrients. I would not mess with these unless your soil test tells you you need it, if you get one, and you have expert advice about how much to apply, because the amount you have to put on a garden if you're short on boron is a whisper. Like, it's so small. And if you put on too much, you can make it so that you can't ever grow ever again, which is not good. Do we have any comments or questions about this so far?
Fran had one earlier about chicken pellets as manure to enrich it,
Oh yeah.
enrich soil.
Fran, what are you curious about that? I have to get rid of this machine.
I just want to know your view about that. I tend to put down chicken pellets every spring as enrichment for the soil, and then I put compost on top of that. So I'm just interested in your view about whether that's a good idea.
Any time that we keep putting fertilizer on, which is a thing that we should do, when we do that and we do the same routine every year, it can be handy to get a soil test to see if a soil test.
Oh, okay.
So certainly if I were having somebody start growing, I would not say you can't grow a garden without a soil test. But after a few years, it might be handy to have a soil test to know how it's going and see if something's building up from that, or it has a nutrient deficiency. So that is as specific as I would get.
Okay, thank you. So am I hearing that putting chicken pellets on every single year may not be a good idea?
The way you would know whether or not it's working is your garden thriving without any deficiencies that you notice? And another way you would know is to get a soil test.
Okay.
To just check, yeah. Okay. You can also try cover crops. So cover crops are crops you don't plan to eat, weirdly, but you can put them on. Say in the winter, you're putting your beds to sleep and you say, gosh, this thing's going to be a weedy mess by spring. Do I cover it up with plastic? No, that keeps out good rain and we need that. And I'm worried about this. You can put a cover crop on And that cover crop will hold the soil, and also it picks up the nutrients out of the bed into its own body so they don't get rinsed away. And in some cases, if they're the right thing, like one of those legumes, peas, beans, vetch, alfalfa, those guys have that relationship with the bacteria that pull the nitrogen out of the air and put it into the plant. So you're actually growing nitrogen, like nitrogen nutrients for your garden. And then before it has a chance to make seeds, you cannot let it get kind of tough or seedy. So right when it starts to bloom, or even right before that, you get your mower out and you mow the heck out of it. And then you gently go under the soil and flip it over, because you want that to get dug into your soil. If you leave it on the surface, some people say, I'm a no-till grower, so I'm going to leave it on the surface. If you leave something high nitrogen on the surface, you can lose half the nitrogen in it in the first 24 hours. I think that's the number. So it's nice, if you want to retain that, to turn it under. What they don't do is they don't create minerals out of nothing. People will say, oh yeah, this will increase the calcium in your soil. They can't do that because there aren't any special bacteria that pull calcium out of the air, because there's no calcium. Tree roots do that because they go into the very deep soil and then they bring it up into their leaves, which is a reason that we use leaves in the garden, one of the reasons. But there has to be calcium way down for it to bring up. Okay, nitrogen is an escape artist. The positively charged stuff will stay in your soil a little bit better. So potassium will stay in your soil, calcium stays in pretty well. But nitrogen has two qualities. One is that it's negatively charged. It's not interested in sticking to the soil. And in its pure form, it's a gas, so it'll just fizz off into the air. So it's all the stuff you would expect. Be nice to your soil. Put in some organic matter. Don't till more than you have to. Add your nitrogen in the spring rather than in the fall. Our national calendars will sometimes say, put your nitrogen amendments, your compost or manures in the fall. But here it rains and it rinses it all into the watershed. And so we don't want to do that. We use our nitrogen amendments in the springtime, and we time them so that they're growing the leaves. So if I have a tomato plant, I want to amend the bed with fertilizer and compost so that the tomato can grow big leaves. But once it's setting fruit, unless it looks yellow, like it's really nutrient deficient, I am not going to give it a lot of extra nitrogen, because I want it to ripen that fruit, and nitrogen stimulates leaves. So if you've ever had a tomato plant that grows tons and tons and tons of leaves, and you were simultaneously feeding it lots of nitrogen and it didn't fruit, you might try cutting back on that nitrogen so that it has a little bit of a life crisis and says, hey, I'm not immortal, I can't grow forever, so I better get to business and make some tomatoes. And yeah, you can mulch your beds and think about using those cover crops. This is an intimidating cover crop chart. I want to show it to you. It's available in a lot of local nurseries. Bayhay has it hanging above the cover crop seed bins. And you don't have to pay attention to all of this. You might want to know when the thing will grow, so you have when to plant. And you might want to know, does it make nitrogen for me? Does it capture nitrogen? So all of those do. But they can give you advice. Your local nursery can give you advice about what you say, this is what I want it to do, and they'll help you find a cover crop seed. And you should consider getting a soil test. So as I said, if you're early on in gardening, or things are going well for you and you're strongly opposed to soil tests, you don't have to get it. But just in case, I want you to know how. So it can tell you a lot. It can tell you the pH of your soil and whether you're deficient in something. And the local one that Kitsap Conservation District uses is A&L. There's a link for it. It's a $25 test. And it helps you, for example, know what your soil pH is. Here's why we want to know about your soil pH. You can see here that if it's between 6 and 6.5, you'll have wide bands for all of these nutrients, even up to 7. It's a pretty wide band for all of these nutrients. That means they're available. But if we get down to very acidic soil, those bands are smaller, and that means it's not as available to the plants. And there are home test kits. And I've heard some people really like them, but they are typically not very reliable. So going to a lab is kind of nice. So here's one of your other hurdles if you're going to do a soils test, is this list of confusing letters. This S1BN, this is just pH, phosphorus. Those are the people who invented the test. And then it's just stuff that you would want to know about in your soil. How much potassium is in there and things like that. And you end up getting back, oh, first of all, you submit like this, sorry. This slightly intimidating thing to get over is the form. Sample ID, what does that even mean? Well, I'm doing blueberries, so I'm gonna write BLUES. You make up the codes. Veggies, you can write in here. You want the S1BN because it's the basic one. And then they ask you these kind of intimidating questions. Do your best. It's not really a big deal. It says previous crop. You might say lawn. And then you want recommendations, and you want it in pounds per 1,000 square feet because you're not a farmer. And they give you back this kind of intimidating looking thing, but thank goodness it has a graph. Apparently, this person had a lot of magnesium and not enough sulfur. So that's a good start. It gives you these guidelines, and these are very big numbers, pounds of things per acre. That is a pretty intimidating thing as well. But look what I got for you here. These people, this is a link on the resource page. These folks will walk you through it. You actually email it to them, you call them ahead, and then you email it to them, and they'll walk you through it and help you figure out exactly what you're going to put on your garden and how much you're going to put on your garden in order to do what your soils test recommended. I don't think you have to do a soil test, but I know it is intimidating, and there are these little obstacles each time somebody looks at the form or they look at the graph and they just go, I don't know what to do with this. But there are ways to help make it easier for yourself. So this is a list of all the things that we talked about, that I talked about in my long monologue. And this is a good book that kind of goes over it and gives you a little bit of a different perspective on it. It's basically the same stuff, but it is available. It's linked on the resource page. You can get it from the library, and you can get it from your local sellers. And that is almost it for me, but we're going to do 2 tomato things if our people are here for them. So our May Veg Club is going to be a Tuesday at 6:30. And it's going to be about how to attract insects and other organisms that can help you solve your pest problems. And also we'll be able to get to know them. It's kind of like a field trip to see, a virtual field trip to meet all of these organisms, which look scary and we think they're spreading disease or something, but almost none of them are. And they are very, very helpful to us. And now, tomatoes, if we can see them. Don McInnes, are you here?
I am.
Oh, I hear some speaking, but
I'm here.
I can't
This is
quite
John.
hear
I'm
you.
here.
Hi, John.
Hi.
John, you have your tomato list. I'm going to stop my sharing for a second here. Do you, I wondered if people had questions about that tomato list that you shared.
Yeah, couldn't somebody bring it up? Is that possible?
Yeah, I'm going to find it. So John, can you review why you created that list and what you were originally talking about?
I think there was a question about tomatoes in the chat at on the last session, and somebody asked what varieties I had grown, because I think last year I grew about 400 to 500 pounds of tomatoes, and out of about let's say about 20 to 25, I can't remember the exact count of plants. And so I created a list, if anybody who's interested in the varieties that I have been successful with. I see in the chat there's some other varieties here, that one of which I have grown, Brandywine. But the varieties that I listed are ones that I've been pretty successful with. And there it is there. Tomatoes are basically two different types. Determinate, which is what I call kind of a bush tomato. It will grow to about 2, maybe 3 feet tall and then stop growing. Indeterminate tomatoes will grow and grow and grow. They'll grow across the ground. They'll grow up your trellises, whatever you have for it to grow on. They will keep growing until basically the frost kills them. So on the determinate type bush, there's a listing there of the different types that I have been successful with. I grow these in a 15-gallon nursery pot, which I consider to be about the minimum size for a bush tomato.
That's really good to know.
Yeah, I would grow them in 20-gallon pots if I could move a 20-gallon pot. But they get pretty heavy at even at 15 gallons. Some of them are the Burbank is named after Luther Burbank. And if anybody knows the history on Luther Burbank, his gift to the Northwest is the Himalayan blackberry. But in spite of that, I grow his tomato. Silvery fir is another plant. Its leaves are very dainty, if you will, very it's almost like a little fir tree. Beaver Lodge slicing is a very, very, very flavorful tomato, a lot of juice. Home slice I grew last year or two. They didn't put on a lot, but they were good uniformly shaped tomatoes. Glacier is another one that I've grown, and I like that. The indeterminate ones here, probably one of my favorite of indeterminates are Goliath Early. They're a very firm tomato. They last a long time. In fact, this year I bought some of the other Goliath plants that Totally Tomato has, seeds that Totally Tomato has, and I'll see how those go. Cosmonaut Volkov, I originally got those at Bainbridge Gardens as a plant, and they are more of an heirloom in appearance. They're a little bit longer on the season, the 72 days. So you'll have a little bit of a harder time getting those going, but every time I've grown Cosmos, I've got fruit. The number of days has to do with how fast a tomato matures. If you think of a cherry tomato, I don't know what a cherry tomato will mature in, but call it 30 days. And then if you think about a beefsteak, it might be 90 days. Well, generally, not a rule, but generally, the larger your tomato is, the longer the season it needs to mature. So I tend to stick around the 60, 65, 55 a day, because cherry tomatoes are a little bit more of a nuisance for me. And beefsteaks I can barely get, but most of these that are in a 2-inch to 3-inch, even 1.5 inches, to me are a good size for canning, good size for just processing, eating fresh or whatever.
And I see you have yellow ones as well.
Yeah, a couple of yellows there. And then tomato size, I found this online somewhere and I stuck it in here because a lot of the website lists will tell you how many ounces they are. I can't, my brain doesn't work in ounces, it works in inches. So I threw this in here
Okay.
to, if in case you're looking up a tomato and it says, well, they're 5-ounce tomatoes. Well,
Mhm.
I can't correlate that.
And we're looking at
Down-
your harvest here.
Yeah, down at the bottom
Wow.
here on the 2 pictures there, if you can, before you go to the bottom one, the 2 pictures there. This is, I pick in hotel buffet tub things. The top, I try to pick them orange, and the top of those 2 is where I typically pick them, and I was a little bit late this time. And as I was picking the more redder ones, although it wasn't very good at my sorting, I put on the bottom one to give those away quicker or process them quicker.
Mhm, mhm.
And then the last picture that you'll see there, if you go down, is the final picking of last year. And those larger ones on there were the Goliath earlies. And if you notice on the leaves there, there will be a little bit of mildew,
Mhm.
which I get in the end of the year on pretty much most plants. Some are better than others. Burbank is better at resisting it. Goliath early is better at resisting it. Some are not. But I've never been able to get away from that. But to me, the key has been to grow a quicker fruiting tomato and try to just beat the mildew.
The various diseases that hit us at the end of the season.
Yeah, late blight and all that stuff that hits at the end of
Right.
the season. So that's it. If anybody has any specific questions, I can answer them, but that's what I have been successful with.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now let's see if we have specific questions about these tomatoes in particular. When was the last harvest? And Judy, I do see your question, and we'll address it in a second when you speak as well. So Jeffrey wants to know, when was your last harvest?
Gee, I don't remember. It was just ahead of the frost, before we got frost. So some of the plants were dying back. I could possibly, maybe if other people have any questions, I can see if there's a date stamp on the picture in my phone, if I can find it.
Okay. Yeah, and then it says, Beverly Green wants to know, how do you avoid mildew with soil amendment? Beverly, can you tell me more about that? Is that soil mildew?
I'm not sure what it is. I had a problem with mildew for the last 2 years, and I changed out the soil, got good soil for organic vegetable gardens from Tilth, and I still had the problem. It drains well. I didn't do soil testing, and when I looked at all the stuff, I just was too overwhelmed, and there was
I know
nothing.
it is overwhelming, yeah. And I was trying
really
to
tested
speed through, but
for mildew or bacteria, which I think is more the problem I'm having. There's some kind of mold in the soil, but then mold's normal in soil, as you tell us.
yeah, I mean, we are relying on it for sure. So what is the symptom of this problem?
Kind of a powdery leaves, and the leaves start
Yeah, okay. So if you replace the soil, you would have to sterilize everything, and you can't really sterilize like wood. And also powdery mildew is very mobile. So what we can do is, does this happen like September, August, September?
earlier, unfortunately.
Okay.
Late July.
Do you water your plants a lot?
Yeah, well, that's what I thought maybe was the problem. Maybe I overwatered, and because I have a drip, but it doesn't seem to give enough. And then we have very dry summers. So then I'll just supplement it with plain, water.
Well, here's a weird thing about powdery mildew.
Yeah.
It does like an overcast day, so it likes that kind of humidity, but it loves dry roots. It is in a plant with dry roots that's not getting enough consistent, even moisture on the roots, or perhaps has extended roots further out than you think, and you're watering here and the roots are way out to here. Those plants are much more susceptible to powdery mildew. We hear mildew and we're sure this must be not true, but it's well documented that that will happen to crops. So sometimes the solution is to make sure that you have more dense drip or that if you can water the soil without a lot of splashing, that's a nice thing to do. But powdery mildew, once it starts, is not really curable. But having enough moisture, last year I watered some pumpkins that always get powdery mildew, and I thought I'm just going to make sure that they're my babies and that the soil, it's not drenched. It's just that I don't say, oops, 4 days ago I should have watered and I haven't, right? So I was just more careful with them. Zero powdery
Yes,
mildew.
making sure they don't dry out at all. I was thinking of just improving on my drip irrigation so it had a longer intervals throughout and more holes.
Yeah, closer, you mean more. That's a possibility. And
Yeah.
also when we leave it on, when we turn it on, we think, oh, that's got to be long enough. But you might dig down where you're sure, I'm sure it's enough water. And you dig down and it's gone down like that far in a
Mhm.
little circle that big, especially if the soil actually got dry. It can be quite surprising how it's not as deep as we think it is.
Yeah, I did a drainage test and that was fine. The mix of sand just seemed fine, but it's new soil now. So some of the things that you discussed, I was already planning to put more compost on it. Do you have any recommendation for the kind of compost? It's an organic garden, so I don't want to use cow manure or fish because we're vegetarian.
Okay, you don't want manure,
Yeah,
any
per
manure,
se.
horse manure?
No, probably not,
No
but
horse manure.
yeah, but mushroom compost or fish, is that okay? Or do you just
Fish?
really use manure and put up?
No, I don't. I may have said manure a couple of times. It's just, I don't particularly. I can put a compost and soil amendments chart onto the resource page, so it won't show up right now, but it will be on the resource page in a few minutes. And there will be sources on there.
Okay, great. And
And you
that's a
can choose.
library site where I will find that?
No, it's in the chat now.
Okay,
Or you can scroll up and see where the April resource page is.
thank you.
Oh my goodness.
Question.
Have you, let's see. Fran
This is
says
John.
she puts, oh,
This is John
sorry.
again. This is John again. I had one comment.
Mhm.
I replaced my soil in my tomato pots every year. And I still get
Mhm.
mildew. And
Yeah.
last year I brought the soil with the backhoe up from about 6 feet down and I still had mildew. So it isn't coming from, I mean, it may have come from residual soil, off my ground tomatoes or whatever, but you can't, it is, just like Carol says, very hard to get rid of. It's not a mildew, as I understand. Is that correct? I mean, it's not a moisture mildew
No,
as we think of mildew. Yeah, so that's the other thing I do is I water every day by hand. So try to keep it consistent.
right. Yeah. Yeah, even a solution that some commercial growers use for powdery mildew is they actually spray water on the leaves to get it to, sorry, to rinse the spores off, and then they get it dry really fast. I'm not recommending that. I don't really know about that, but I know they do. Okay, I have to give Judy a message. Okay, Judy said, Fran asked, can I put cardboard on my bed to prevent rain washing out my soil? And yeah, I think it helps. Yes. Leaves help because it's not being pounded quite so much. And the cardboard would divert some of the moisture off. It's not keeping it dry, but you don't necessarily want to keep your soil bone dry over winter. So and Judy said she uses cardboard around her plants and in the walkways, and Burnt Ridge Nursery has a video showing the improvement around mulberries. The cardboard and mulch side grew about a third bigger than the other side. So I guess that probably mulching your soil increases the microorganisms in your soil. Judy, did you take off? I know you said you had to go.
She did. She just put a message in there, said she had to take off.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I see that she did take off. Ah, I keep trying to get her to tell us about her tomatoes, but I'll do that in a second. Laura says, have you heard of placing banana peels in the bottom of planting holes? Yes, I think that's because they have phosphorus in them. It's definitely folklore, but folklore is not necessarily bad, but it's also not complete. So if you were short on phosphorus, is it phosphorus? No, it's potassium. Sorry. Bananas have potassium, and I think that's the idea. That's what I've been told anyway. John, do you harvest seeds for your next season? Do you seed save? John McInnes?
I do I harvest seeds?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't. I've thought about doing it, but I've not.
Mm-hmm. Anna has a question about her Brussels sprouts. She planted them last year and got tiny sprouts by December because she planted them late, and they're still in the beds. Will they produce Brussels sprouts later in this year? Anna, what's probably going to happen is those tiny sprouts will open up and stretch out and try to make a flower. They're not becoming a flower themselves, those leaves, but they'll try to grow an extension and then grow a little flower. But you can let them do that and then you can eat them. Like mine are doing that now, and they're tender and delightful. And next year, you can put your sprouts, you can start your sprouts between mid-April and mid-May. It depends on the variety, but I do mine sometimes third week of April, and they are the size of whales by the time winter comes around. You want a really big plant. Yeah, you want a big plant so that you can get big sprouts. Okay. Jeffrey says, many ants under my starter pots. What does it mean? They just like, ants like the moisture that's available. And this time of year, ants are everywhere. They are looking for where to move, where to get food. They're looking for everything. So people have them all over the place. Oh, and it's actually Heidi. Sorry. Heidi's asking that. Okay. Oh, John says October 7th was his final harvest of tomatoes. Okay. In the link are Judy, I'm sorry, in the chat are Judy Hart's tomatoes. And I wanted her to tell us about them because she advocates eating on the wild side, which is eating plants that have the colors and nutrients of their wild ancestors, and they are much more nutritious. So there is a website called Eating on the Wild Side. It's linked on the resource page. And there's a book as well. This person has done a lot of research. I think this is originally, she's not a scientist, but she's a good researcher, and she looked at nutrients in, for example, a dark red apple versus a yellow apple, and that they can be extremely different, and that there are particular varieties of tomatoes that are more nutritious, much more nutritious, have more anthocyanins and antioxidants and things like that, that we sort of bred out of plants. So in the process of getting our plants modernized, we also bred them to be sweeter and have fewer anthocyanins because those compounds can be less sweet and things like that. So there is a link in the chat, and there's a link on the resource page to those. So I would love her to tell us about those sometime. I think she was going to do it at the end, but she had to go. So next time is beneficial insects, planting for beneficial insects, and mostly predators to help you with your gardens. So I think that's it, John Fawcett.